Hello and welcome back to the Property and Lending Podcast. Today we are joined with Fadi and Mark as always. How are you, gentlemen?
Going.
Good. Mark, I like your jumper.
Yeah, thanks. It's always an awkward silence at the beginning, so I always look forward to it.
Yeah, I know. That's why I always come to you, because you never say hello. You never say hi back to me. It's very, very awkward. Anyway, moving on. We also have a very special guest today. Someone that we all work with in our roles, in our businesses and whatnot. Easily the best in the business. And if anyone thinks they're better, I challenge that completely. So we have Adriana from Trinity Legal Migration. Adriana, can you just say hello, introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody.
What's going on?
I'm Adriana. I'm a solicitor, and I work with all the guys on a few deals that they put through. And we do a lot of conveyancing through in New South Wales, Queensland, and South Australia, alongside other services as well.
Cool. So last week we recorded an episode about due diligence. We were talking about building and press inspections, finance clauses, property management, all that stuff. And then obviously a big part of due diligence is looking at the contracts, going through the contracts, speaking with your solicitor and whatnot. And none of us were qualified to discuss that. So we're very grateful that you have given us your time to come on. We know you're very, very busy. So before we just ask you some pretty basic questions about, the process. When do you get involved? What's going on? Because a lot of people, because we're in the industry, we sometimes forget, but a lot of people might only purchase one property their entire life, or two properties, and it might be 10 years after they purchased the first one, and things change, so they don't know the process. So I might ask the first question, just real basic, and then I'll let Mark and Fadi jump in as well. What actually is your role in the property purchasing process, and when do you get involved?
All right. So our role in the whole process is to look at the actual contract, all the provisions of the contract, special conditions, any of the attachments to the contract, advise you on it, and make sure that everything is above board, and to assist you with actually transferring legal title of the property from the vendor to you guys as or whoever the purchaser is. When we get involved and when you want to approach us, most people like to know how much it's going to cost, so they probably reach out a bit early on to query how much the fees are going to be and what they're going to be out for on settlement. And then whenever they find a property that they're actually interested in, they'll flick the contract over to us to have a look at. New South Wales, probably the contracts in New South Wales are the most extensive because solicitors like to shove lots of special conditions in there. So the things you need to look out for with those special conditions is that they can add additional liabilities on purchases, which is what we'll advise you on. And we'll try and request amendments to those provisions to try and minimise the liability for penalty interest and additional legal costs in the event something goes wrong before settlement or on settlement. If you sign a contract before sending it to us, if there's a cooling off period, it's okay. If you've been able to negotiate that beforehand, but if there's no cooling off period, the contract immediately becomes binding on you and we can't negotiate anything. We can try, but a vendor solicitor or the vendor really don't have any incentive to negotiate anything further because you're already bound to the deal. So better to send us the contract early on, or to your solicitor or conveyancer early on before you sign something if possible, just so they can check whether or not there's a cooling off period and whether we can negotiate anything for you to make the transaction process smoother for you in the event things go wrong.
Beautiful, very extensive response. I like it. We'll make for a good clickbait later on. Fadi, Mark, do you have any questions before I keep going?
Yeah, I guess I'll go off something that Adriana said in regards to if you've signed a contract, so it's a binding contract, that's it. There's not really that many changes. I guess I'll go to like something that we deal with a lot, especially during COVID, is the 66W contract. So is there a way to prevent that in regards to making changes to those contracts? So maybe a week before auction, for example, because we see those contracts, at auctions mainly. A week before auction, send the contract to you. You can go through the amendments, make those changes, communicate with the vendor solicitors, or how does it work? Is there a way where you can actually make those changes prior to auction or prior to signing a 66W?
Yeah. So in New South Wales, more often than not, you'll find a 66W hidden in a contract. And that's because in the market in New South Wales, as you guys probably know better than I, is very different to Queensland and South Australia or any other state. The vendors want to know that it's a done deal and it's secure. So when you have a 66W in there, it's a notification or a confirmation from your solicitor that you've had advice and you understand there's no cooling off period and it's immediately binding. They're always in contracts where the property is going to auction or has been put up for auction and didn't sell at auction, passed in. And sometimes even when the property isn't listed for auction, the vendors just want a done deal. They're not willing to sit around and wait for 10 days, or if it's going to be like cooling off extended, say 15 days, to see if a purchaser is going to go through with a deal, because they'll miss out on other prospective purchases. So prior to auction, where a property is listed for auction, send us the contract or to your conveyancer or solicitor beforehand. If it's a week before, if it's a few days before, your solicitor will give you advice about the contract and they'll request those amendments from the vendor solicitor prior to auction. Anything that's agreed to prior to auction will bind the parties if the purchaser successfully secures the property at auction. If you try and negotiate provisions after auction, like I said before, the vendor really has no incentive to negotiate anything. It's a done deal, you're stuck. Why should I change any of those provisions? So always better do it before. And even if it's a day before auction, try and get it to a solicitor or conveyancer to look at and try to negotiate, reduce just even basic things for the purchaser's interest, like a reduced deposit of 5%, not releasing a deposit after exchange. If you need an extended settlement period because you don't have any pre-approvals in place and there's no way your bank is going to be able to settle in 42 days, things like that are just basic things that you should really try and get sorted out before the auction.
Perfect.
I saw the pain in Mark's eyes just then. The extension.
That's never.
Yeah.
I was going to ask with the
It's happening a lot where clients are purchasing properties and signing contracts like, oh, I like this house, and then not realizing finance isn't really in order and it's going to take a little bit longer than 42 days to sort out. And in those cases, you will end up copying additional penalties for like penalty interest. So for each day that the settlement is delayed from the proposed settlement date, and most contracts will have additional special conditions where you have to pay the vendors additional legal costs for that delay. So it's an unnecessary expense that you can possibly negotiate out of if you just send the contract to your solicitor. And even if it costs you a little bit of money to have the contract reviewed beforehand by a conveyancer or a solicitor, it still saves you in the long run in the event things go wrong.
100%. We always get, like, especially first home buyers, they always ask us, what exactly does a solicitor do? And I told them, like, I know what I look at in the contract. I don't know what they look at the contract, so I can't really tell you. But if you're buying $1 million property and you're putting down 100 grand when you win the auction, why are you going to risk over a few grand? Like, at the end of the day, it's like insurance. I feel like it's like insurance. They make sure that the job gets done with minimal sort of further costs to the client.
Especially just on that, sorry, Mark, to cut you off, but particularly first home buyers or any buyer really, when they're looking at a house that they're looking to move into, so it's not an investment to rent out or anything, they tend to fall in love with the property because it's really pretty and it's furnished really nicely. It's like, quick, there's lots of competition, we want to secure this property. But especially those deals where it's a brand new property and it's just been built or it's had extensive renovations, one of the key things you need to watch out for as well is insurances. So I recently reviewed a contract where there were no insurances, a brand new property, no insurances attached to the contract. So we have no way of knowing whether or not this builder was a licensed builder who built it, what the warranties are that are in place, whether or not there's already been, I mean, they say it's supposed to be a brand new property, so there shouldn't be any claims made, but we also want to check out who this builder is. Have they had any claims made against them? Have any policies been paid out under the insurance? So things like that are really, really important to check through your solicitor or your conveyancer.
I was going to ask one more question. So with these 66W contracts that get signed, let's say the customer didn't have a pre-approval, had no idea what their borrowing capacity is, and signs a contract and then goes to the broker. Broker says can't actually, you're not going to get the money from the bank essentially, and it's not going to happen. After, let's say it's $1 million property, they put down the 100 grand, 10% deposit initially. Is there further costs involved now that they can't continue with obviously they lose the 100 grand, but is there anything else?
Yeah. So a lot of solicitors will actually add a special condition to the contract, which says that the purchaser warrants or guarantees that they have pre-approvals in place or they have finance in place and that they have capacity to enter into this contract and that they'll be able to complete it. So when you're unable to secure finance to complete a contract, essentially you're in breach of that contract, and a vendor can serve you with notice of termination. So once the settlement date approaches and you're unable to settle, they're likely to serve you with a notice to complete. And a notice to complete is sort of putting you on official notice that you've got 14 days to settle this. Otherwise, the vendor can terminate the contract, keep the whole deposit that you've paid. And if you've paid 5% rather than 10%, you're still liable for the whole 10%. So they'll come after you for that. And then penalty, interest, additional legal costs to the vendor. And then they also will reserve their right to come after you for the whole purchase price or for any deficit in resale price. So if they then relist the property to sell and they sell it for, say, 200 grand less than what you had entered into, they would have grounds to come after you to pursue you, like with further legal action, to recover all those costs. It's not often that it happens, but I have had it happen with one particular client. And it depends really, I guess, on the vendor and whether they're willing. Actually, two matters I've been involved in that has happened, but it really depends on the vendor and what outlay they're willing to, how much they're willing to spend to recoup those costs, because obviously it's going to cost the vendor money to pursue the purchaser for a breach of contract. There's no sort of police, there's nowhere you can complain and say, hey, this person didn't complete, they owe me this much money, get it back for me. It requires full legal action and would go to a court. It's an extensive and expensive process. So there's a lot of potential additional costs if a purchaser can't complete on a contract because they entered into it prematurely. So yeah, best to avoid.
I was going to say as well, especially in this market where it's kind of declining, if they sign a contract today and in 6 weeks later say we can't complete, in that 6 weeks the market might have shifted quite a bit and they might have been able to sell it again, but like you said, for 200 grand less. Wouldn't surprise me too much in this current market, particularly in some suburbs. So yeah, definitely worth noting.
Yeah, no, purchases have to be super careful. Just anything, like it's a big purchase. Do not get, sign happy and sign straight away just because the house is pretty or the agent said this, this, and this, or you think you're going to get the finance. Have those assurances in place before you sign something.
I think you also touched base on contracts. I want to go back to the home and land package. So in COVID as well, we saw like a ridiculous amount of customers come through, including myself, purchasing a home and land package where there's two separate contracts. And a lot of customers are asking, so why do I need a conveyancer to look at this? Why can't I get a conveyancer to look at it when it's close to settlement, close to subdivision of the land, etc.? Can you walk us through that? Because I know, like from experience, there's a few clauses. And for some reason, you can probably answer this, is that every time we send through a land contract or a home and land contract to conveyancers, they come back with 34 conditions, or like that's like one of the highest numbers I've had on one of those deals, but they're pretty normal to come back with so many conditions because builders, solicitors are trying to get things in there and some sort of clauses to delay the process.
Yeah. So house and land packages are they can be very complex. Often when you have a house and land package deal, it's a really, really big development. So there's a lot of, there's potential for a lot of lots to be created. And you'll find that it's not usually the land contract, but it's usually, it depends on the arrangement, but often you'll find there's a special condition in either the building contract or the land contract, which requires both to exchange simultaneously, or for the building contract to exchange first, like to be signed first before they'll exchange the land contract. And that's just whatever commercial deals that the vendor has in place with whatever builders. But things to look out for is often with building contracts, and particularly now we're hearing of a lot of distress in the building industry with companies falling through and going broke and whatnot. They'll have a lot of special conditions in there, obviously to safeguard the builders. And always remember, in any contract, the vendor or the builder or whoever the party is who's engaging you is going to draft the contract to benefit them, not to benefit a purchaser, because ultimately they're protecting their own interests. So building contracts will often, and so do the land contracts, have something called a sunset clause or a sunset provision. So a sunset clause is something where the developer, a real estate agent might tell you the subdivision will be done in 3 months. Reality is I've never had anything settle when this real estate agent has said it will. There's always a delay, there's always something going wrong, and it might be weather, it might be council, it might be finance, whatever it is, it's going to delay the process. It never ever happens when they tell you. So sunset clauses allow the vendor to delay that represented settlement date, whatever it was. Initially, they might have 2 years written in the contract, but they always have the authority to serve you with notice to extend that settlement date again, or that sunset date again. Even when an agent tells you it's going to be done in 3 months, if we try and negotiate that sunset clause with a vendor, they never, ever, ever agree to amend it and to cap it to only one extension of 6 months, for example, because it doesn't protect their interests. Ultimately, they can't control when a subdivision is going to happen because things can go wrong. But they can guarantee that you're still bound to the contract until they get all their ducks lined up and everything is ready to go and ready to settle. Same thing with the building contracts. They'll often have provisions in there to safeguard the builder, where they'll have a provision that says, for example, I did one recently, if the land doesn't, if you don't commence construction within 12 months of the date of the contract, the builder can rescind the contract. Or they'll have provisions in there which have additional margins or additional fees that can be charged because of the changes in the costs for, building and construction costs or labour costs or supply costs or whatever. And those are things that purchasers need to watch out for. Like, you might be represented that it'll cost $300,000 to build whatever it is now, but come the time when you actually settle on the land and are ready to build, your builder will be entitled to increase that price by whatever it's, whatever's been accounted in the contract. Is usually a percentage where they'll be able to increase the percentage or increase supply charges or whatever. So there are things that purchasers need to watch out for. And often you'll find that you can't exchange on just the building or just the land. You've got to do both at once. And that's because of whatever arrangement a vendor and developer have in place. Sometimes also with those packages, they have deeds in place, which then add an extra process of stamp duty because we have to send it to, we have to send it to the Office of State Revenue to assess and make sure that, that it's compliant and, everything's been dated and signed by the developer and the vendor and everything. So yeah, they're pretty complicated and they take longer. And often those contracts, I'm sure you guys have noticed, are usually like 300, 400 pages versus in New South Wales, maybe 50 pages, depending on the contract. So they're pretty extensive, and purchasers should be very careful with those because they're probably not going to settle when you think they will. And your finances might change as well. So we've seen some purchasers who may have had pre-approvals in place when they entered into the contract, but because of the delays which have happened to the development, it might settle, say, in a year and a half, the purchaser's finances have changed. So that's where you guys probably have seen similar, like have had to deal with this, trying to then get the purchaser's approvals in place so that they can settle in time. And if they don't, then we end up having to deal with delayed settlement, penalty interest, additional legal costs to the vendor, solicitor, and so on.
I think one thing you mentioned there, and the reason why I brought up the question is that sunset clause, because we have, for example, agents out there, and Kay will probably know more about this, where they have like events on the weekend, come in and purchase, or during the week land. You only have to put down $1,000 or $5,000 to secure it. They don't think about what's in the contract at all. So when they do come around, then they're going, oh, why is this taking so long? Why can't our conveyancer negotiate with the vendor solicitor? I'm like, well, they don't need to, because you've signed the contract that has allowed them to take up to 3 years to be registered, just for the land to be registered. And I think that's the most important thing in regards to the home and land packages. Anyone that's going out there or going to purchase, whether it's first home buyers or not first home buyers, that contract needs to be looked at a lot more earlier than the subdivision or when the land's going to be registered. And I think we've had customers in the past that have actually fallen into that trap where it's just all about excitement. Like first time buyers for myself, I'm like, man, I just want to sign this right now. I want to move in right now. I'm not thinking about what's in the contract. So I think that's the most important clause. Well, I don't think it's the most important, but like one of the main clauses you have to look out for as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, 100%. And a lot of people aren't aware that they can extend the sunset date, which is really important to keep in mind when you're planning like your finances and everything, just to make sure that you do have a smooth settlement when the time comes.
Well, we don't like off plan on here anyway. So off plan
now in this market, people are probably treading cautiously around off the plan.
Yeah.
I mean, I just look at the contracts. I can't give any advice on whether or not it's a good investment or not. But from a contractual point of view, if you're considering the fact that a lot of builders are starting to go broke, or there are shortage supplies and shortages with regards to supplies and shortages with regards to labor, obviously that's going to have an impact on this property that someone might be looking at that's still in the development stages for subdivisions and whatnot. So yeah, people just need to be very careful and make really well-informed decisions about that by speaking to their brokers and their buyers agents and whoever else, their financial planners and everything. So yeah.
And just something you mentioned that I want to pick up on, it's like you were saying before, these contracts sometimes from the time that you sign to the time that it settles, it might be like a year or two or 3, like Fadi was saying. The bank isn't going to be able to give you a formal approval until a maximum of like 3 months before settlement. And so if you're, like you're saying, if your circumstances change, which is common in like a year or two, that might prevent you from being able to complete the purchase. And like you're saying before, there might be charges and that sort of thing that you want to avoid. So one thing we always tell our customers is the way you're applying, like with this current job, with this current payslip, let's say you're not self-employed, you need to make sure that doesn't change before settlement day, because at any time, and we've seen this, I don't know if you've seen this multiple times now, I had this happen just a month ago, banks are doing employment checks where they actually call the employer and say, hi, just doing a loan for this particular person. Are they still working? What are their hours? What's their hourly rate? Are they, like, if it's a contracting role, they're also a bit more cautious about when's their end date and all this sort of stuff. So very important that if your circumstances change, especially if you're going self-employed, never a good time to do it before settlement, because yeah, especially if you're newly self-employed, you're just not going to get the funds. It's just not how it works.
Yeah.
Liam, you're back. What happened?
Yeah, I just the power cut out. So
you had better connection in Bali, man. So
I had to, yeah, I did have better connection in Bali. I reconnect and join, and things are taking a while. So apologies. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
I was just going to ask the question, Adriana, like for our customers as well. Like one of the main questions also: do we just contact the conveyancer, or do we just send her an email? We usually do an introduction to our customers. Do you have to verify him, Face ID, or what's the process? Like, what's the easiest process for the customers out there?
So initially, when we get introductions from you guys or anyone else, usually a client will just reach out with a copy of the contract and a brief background. So are they first home buyers? Are they, just a little bit about themselves or a little bit about the property that they're looking at, purchase price, anything that they've negotiated. So the key things I'd be asking for in a return email from a new customer or new client is, have you negotiated anything yet with the agents, and what is it? So they may have already negotiated like a 5% deposit or an extended settlement period or a deposit bond for some people, things like that, just so I'm aware that that's what's already been agreed to make sure that that's going to be reflected in the contract. At the beginning, I don't need IDs or anything. I just want to see the contracts, and I'll give the clients initial advice on the contract and my recommendations or suggestions about what amendments we should be requesting to the contract. After that, once they've given me instructions on that, and I write to the vendor solicitor seeking those amendments, and they come back and agree, if the purchasers are happy to go ahead, they can go sign the contract and start that process. Once the contract's exchanged, I'll be doing a verification of identity. So different solicitors and conveyancers do everything differently. I send out remote links where my clients can hop online and upload their IDs and everything, and that way I can make sure that it's the correct details that are on the contract. Before they sign the contract, I'll also make sure that their names match what's on their IDs and their finance approvals, because lots of people have 3 or 4 middle names, depending on what cultures we're all from. But if you miss an initial or you miss a middle name that is supposed to be on the contract, we have to go back and get it amended. Other people as well want to buy in some kind of structure, whether it's a corporate structure or a trust or whatever, self-managed super fund, but don't realize that's the name that actually has to go on the contract, and write it in their personal names and sign off because they want to secure the property. Big no-no, because we then have to change it from a personal purchaser to a completely different entity. And in those cases, you could be liable for additional stamp duty, additional legal costs, because we have to rescind the contract and go through the whole process again. So make sure you're putting the correct name as the purchaser on the contracts, and make sure it matches your finance approvals. Check with your finance brokers.
Yeah. And it's that easy as well for them to do it on online as well, to be verified. So a lot of them are asking, like just the customer we had settled yesterday, she called me in the morning, she goes, oh, what do I do? I'm like, what do you mean? What do you need to do? Like, it's settlement day. We just have to wait till it's settled. She goes, oh, I don't have to go somewhere, or Adriana said something like, no, it's all online. So do you want to give us just a basic brief on what PEXA is? Because a lot of the customers are used to their parents, oh, you have to go to a city, to an office and do it manually. So what is PEXA now, and how has it made life so much easier for everyone, I guess?
Yeah. So before, we used to have to all go to this settlement room, and there'd be people yelling across the room, Bob, Smith, Jane, whatever, trying to find who the other parties are for this matter to settle. And we'd all come, huddle around a table with our paper and pens, check every single figure, every single letter and everything, mark it all off. If one letter is incorrect or one figure is incorrect, the whole thing falls through. Go get it amended. Everyone has to come back again the next day, or possibly same day if you could do it same day. Now it's like a virtual settlement room. So all the parties sort of meet in this virtual room, which is usually through PEXA, and you'll have your solicitor, the vendor solicitor, vendor's bank if there is a mortgage, and your incoming bank unless it's a cash purchase. So minimum there are 4 parties in a workspace. And in this workspace is where we draft all the documents which will legally transfer ownership of the property from the vendors to the purchasers, and where the banks will also lodge and discharge the mortgages over the property. And then also that's where all the money gets uploaded and gets paid out on settlement to all the parties, however it's supposed to go. So it makes it much easier for purchasers. They don't need to come anywhere. They don't need to do anything. We verify everything, or your solicitor or conveyance will verify everything with you before settlement. So that's with regards to the adjustments and the figures, any outgoings, any surplus funds or shortfall funds that purchasers are going to be covering will also be sorted leading up to settlement. And then once it all happens in the workspace, the purchasers will get a notification that settlement has happened. The agents will also receive notification that settlement has happened because they hold the deposit money. So they'll get authority to release the deposit money unless there's a reason some of it is going to be withheld to cover the cost of anything that may have been agreed to. And then you can pick up the keys from the agent once that order on agent has been received by the selling agent. So it makes it much easier for solicitors and for conveyancers and for banks. It also means that if there are any errors, they can be instantly fixed usually in the workspace, and we don't have to go back to the bank to get new checks. We don't have to go back and get documents re-signed, whatever. It's all virtual and electronic, and we can contact clients, we can contact banks and chase them and get things happening pretty quickly so that we mitigate the risk of settlements falling through and hopefully get them settled the same day.
Perfect.
I was going to say as well, with the contract names, I had once a newly married couple, the wife thought it'd be cute if she uses the husband's last name. May seem like a good idea, but also if it doesn't match as your ID, the bank's going to sit there asking for certified marriage certificates, and it's a bit of a hassle. So just leave it as it is. So with that, let's say they do. So one of the party or both parties change their name. Both of their old names are on the title deeds and on the loan documents with the bank and everything like that. Is there a big process to get it changed if they just the wife's just changing her last name, for example?
So if they already own the property and then they want to change the names on the title? Yeah. So we can change the names. We need all the documents, and you actually have to apply to change the names on the title. I don't know how it works on the banking side, but with the title side, it can be done, but it's a process and you've just got to get all your documents together and do it. Often when people are selling property, they'll do a stat dec and just verifying, like providing evidence that they're both the same person. So your birth certificate, passport. As a minimum in New South Wales for any property transaction, we need your passport, Australian passport, and your driver's license. And if there's a difference because of a marriage or divorce or whatever, then we also need the evidence to substantiate or corroborate that name change. So a marriage certificate in the event that you've changed to your husband's name, or a divorce certificate if you've gone back to your maiden name, plus your birth certificate to show the original name. So yeah, it's just a documentation process, and for everything there is a way to do it as long as you have the documents and you go through the process of actually transferring and changing the names.
I have a question. I don't know why you're laughing.
Mark.
We went silent to give you a chance to get in before Get into another.
You guys are, my questions are a bit random because you guys have answered you guys have asked the questions I was going to ask because we've pretty much gone through the process of start to finish, start to settlement. So I've got some out of the box questions. They're not tough, don't worry. When I imagine what a solicitor does, right, I imagine a very passive aggressive lifestyle of you sending really passive emails to the other solicitor and then replying with very passive aggressive emails. Is that what it's like? Do you feel like, is there ever like feisty or like you get like there's a lot of pressure and anger? You're just like, oh, whatever. You like desensitized to it.
No, look, I think there's really no benefit to being unpleasant with any party. At the end of the day, your solicitor or your conveyancer is doing their job representing your best interest, and the vendor solicitor or conveyancer is just doing their job representing their client's best interest. But it does nobody any good when either solicitor gets nasty and aggressive or, and I'm not saying like that's me personally, and I have dealt with solicitors who have been really nasty on the other side, but it does nothing to benefit the whole transaction or either party, and it doesn't mean you're a better lawyer because you're meaner. So I hope it's not like that. And most of the solicitors and conveyancers that I deal with have been really, really lovely, and we all understand it's all professional etiquette and courtesy to each other in all our dealings. But sometimes things happen where vendors or purchasers can be really unreasonable. And I guess that's when solicitors will start to get a bit aggressive or, threaten further legal action, particularly where there's, delays to settlement and, one party is starting to suffer a loss because of the other party. So, yeah. I'm about to lose power. I need a plug in. I'm sorry. Give me 1 minute.
No
worries. Hey? What did you say?
Questions.
I ask good questions. That's what I'm here for. You guys ask the important questions, and I ask the good questions.
While we wait,
no, genuinely, like when you think about it, like I assume like solicitors they hate each other. I don't know.
I reckon in between, especially for the home and land packages, when you go with the vendor solicitors, they have no interest in negotiating because they're doing like 100 lots on one land, so they're all pretty much the same. And I think we've all experienced that kind of backlash anyway from vendor solicitors at some point. But obviously, they've got the best interest of their vendors as well. So, yeah, understandable.
Yeah.
While we wait, should we go through the different like settlement, like the cooling off and the subject spines and all that sort of stuff and how it differs between states? Like what's the norm in New South Wales as opposed to South Australia, Queensland?
Yeah, for sure. So New South Wales cooling off period, generally 5 to 10 days. You can usually ask for 10 days. It's not usually a problem. 5 days, I think, is now the new norm. But it is between 5 and 10 days. Obviously, if it's an auction campaign in any state, you have no cooling off period, regardless. In Queensland, you have a cooling off period of 5 days from memory. So they get jumbled up sometimes because we buy in different states, but 5 days. But you also have a finance clause, 21 days, and a building and pest clause, 21 days. Or for the building and pest and finance clauses, obviously your days are negotiable, but it's generally 21 days, if not 14. Adelaide is 2 day cooling off period. So you have 2 days to do a cooling off, to cool off, but you also have a finance clause in Adelaide, which is standard. However, you don't have a building and pest clause. So in Adelaide, we do our building and pests within the first 2 days during the cooling off period. And the builders in Adelaide all are aware, obviously, of the 2 day rule. So they're in and out pretty quick and they get the reports back to you pretty quick. So they work with you. One thing with Adelaide, though, regarding the 2 day cooling off period, in New South Wales, Brisbane, Queensland, pretty much any other state, your cooling off period starts once you sign the contract, right? In Adelaide, it actually doesn't. So you've got 2 days, but in Adelaide, you have a separate document called a Form 1. So you have your contract of sale, which is your name, the vendor's name, what you're buying, how much you're buying it for, what the deposit is, just the standard stuff. And then you have a Form 1. And the Form 1 has your title search and all the other searches that come in the other contracts in like Queensland and New South Wales. But in Adelaide, you get this Form 1 separate. And if the cooling off doesn't actually start till you receive your Form 1 documents. So a lot of times when we purchase off-market properties, for example, in South Australia or we'll get the contract of sale signed, but the Form 1 hasn't been ordered yet because the property was off market and the vendors weren't ready or the agent wasn't ready. So they still have to order the Form 1. So we might receive a Form 1 document a week later. And for that week, even though the cooling off period in Adelaide is only 2 days, for that week, you still haven't started your cooling off period. So it is 2 days, but there is a little technicality there, I guess, with Form 1s. And sometimes if we are having delays with building and pest and whatnot, we actually speak with the agents and ask them to just hold off sending that. And usually they're pretty okay to do so. But yeah, it is only 2 days in Adelaide.
That's a question I've always wanted to ask, Adriana. Why is it always, and I know this is worldwide, so I just don't think it's here in Australia. Why has every state got its own certain rule? Like, why is it so complicated? Because in every single state, like when we first started working with KM, he was sending us these contracts, even looking at different South Australia contracts are so much more different to New South Wales, Brisbane. And I think to myself, it's the same country, but why is there such like different legislation between each state? Like it's a...
Yeah. Look, I don't have the answer to that, to be honest. Every state is different in how they do it and who prepares the contract. Like Queensland, South Australia is the agent. New South Wales, it's solicitors. Agents are not allowed to prepare contracts and are actually very restricted in what they can do with respect to a contract. Yeah, and I think maybe that's why New South Wales contracts have so many special conditions shoved in there, and why it's so much more, I guess, potentially litigious, because it's solicitors drafting it rather than real estate agents. Yeah, whereas I think Queensland, South Australia, you'll find the contracts are usually the standard contract. Very rarely do we find extensive special conditions in Queensland and South Australia, except for when they're adding, for example, special conditions because of COVID and shutdown and lockdowns and whatever to delay settlement, or if it's the finance or building or rent back provisions. But yeah, I don't have an answer for why it's all different, but it would be great if one day everything was uniform.
Same.
Yeah, I had a client from Sydney once who had purchased properties in Sydney, where we purchased one in Adelaide, and I sent him the contract, and he literally said to me, "Where's the rest of it?" I said, "It's 2 pages." Like, it's pretty chill.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great point because of who's, I guess, preparing the contracts, and they're all just standard templates. But yeah, I think it's just, every state it's a state government run process. Queensland's just changed their land tax rules for the worse. We should talk about that later. So, sorry?
Everyone just wants to be different. Someone has to do their own particular way.
Just trying to get their own, yeah, for sure. I probably only have like one last question for Adriana. Any major or common pitfalls that you're noticing people, or you've noticed people make when they sign contracts or when they're purchasing properties? Is it simply that they're just not getting yourself involved early enough, or are there something, I don't know, is there like something just common that everyone makes the same mistake and easily avoidable?
I think the basic things, like we mentioned earlier, probably just looking at the settlement period and making sure it's practical or feasible from your broker's point of view, and with regards to your bank being ready in time. Making sure the purchasers' names are correct. 5% deposit is pretty simple as well. Some people haven't actually accounted for the practical cash flow aspect of things and don't realize they actually don't have 10% in cash to give the agent once they sign the contract. So negotiating that from the outset. And then things like people who are purchasing apartments and units, or property that's within a strata complex, considering the fact that there's going to be strata levies, and just considering the regular outgoings of the property that they're going to be liable for. It's not just council and water, there's also strata. And if there are any additional special levies that might be coming up with a particular strata lot, they're things to consider. They're probably the main things. And then with off the plan or brand new properties, looking at insurances, making sure you're actually buying a property that's got insurances in place to protect your interest in the property in the case there are any defects. Swimming pools. Houses with swimming pools are really pretty and nice to buy, but people don't realize they have to be, registered and certified as compliant and everything. And often we're finding, more often than not, swimming pools are not compliant, and either the certificate is excluded from the contract or agents are sort of stalling on passing that information on to purchasers. So when you have a solicitor or conveyancer involved, they'll always ask, is there a swimming pool? Or they'll look up the property and check the photos. And when they see there's a swimming pool, ask for confirmation and look for the certificates to make sure the pool is compliant. Otherwise, purchasers are liable to make sure the pool is recertified as compliant, and they'll have to pay for whatever work is needed to make that pool compliant after settlement. So I think they're probably the main things. They're pretty simple things, but when you're a first home buyer or you haven't bought in a while, or it's a different kind of property that you're buying, so it's not, if it's a strata plan or whatever, they're just things to keep in mind when you get a contract from the agent.
Yeah. Fadi, Mark, any final questions?
I think we covered it all.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Adriana. I think one thing is that obviously you are able to operate in New South Wales, Queensland, and South Australia, which I don't think there's a lot of solicitors that can do that, and that's why we love working with you. And from our experience, definitely the best. So if someone wanted to contact you, not one of our clients, just someone wanted your help for whatever reason, how could they get in touch with you?
Best way is email. So my email address is Adriana, Adriana, at trinitylegalmigration.com.au. And just flick me over an email and I'm happy to answer any questions or help out where I can.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a very insightful episode. Hopefully people will come see you before they sign their contracts.
Or any conveyancer or solicitor, just get advice, protect your interests.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, guys.
No,
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.